When I was a rabbinic student, I accompanied Rabbi A.B. Ingber of University of Cincinnati Hillel to the Federal Correction Institute in Elton, Ohio, to lead a Passover Seder for inmates. A number of years later, when I was serving as rabbi of Temple Bethel in Salinas, California, I led Seders at the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad. Although the irony of celebrating Passover, which is called Zman Cherutenu, the season of our freedom, with people who were not free, was not lost on any of us. The message of hope and redemption was especially meaningful to the inmates. I thought about those experiences this summer when I was at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, and saw in the bookstore the Gurs Haggadah, Passover in Perdition. I had to add it to my collection of Haggadot. I want to introduce you to this amazing document and how the holiday of Passover was observed in the Gurs detention camp in 1941. As we will see, this was not a clandestine observance, as Jewish holiday observances often were in the camps. Nevertheless, the effort that was necessary for the inmates to celebrate Passover under such adverse conditions certainly qualifies this Seder as resistance, just one of the many forms of spiritual resistance that took place in the Gurs camp. Before I speak about the Gurs Haggadah and the Seder that was held in Gurs in 1941, some background is necessary. The Gurs detention camp was created by the French government in April 1939 for political refugees and those who were part of the International Brigade who fled from Spain during the Spanish Civil War. With the start of World War II in the fall of 1939, France rounded up and imprisoned citizens from Germany and Austria, many of whom were Jews, as well as French political leaders who opposed war with Germany. They were sent to a number of detention camps in southwest France, including Gurs, which was the largest of the camps. It was located at the foot of the Pyrenees, about 50 miles from the Spanish border by the village of Gurs. In June 1940, Gurs was part of the territory administered by the Vichy regime after the French armistice with Germany. Many more Jews were arrested and sent to the camp. At the same time, all non-Jewish Germans, Nazi sympathizers, and communists were released. By the end of the year, there were about 3,000 people incarcerated in Gurs. Gurs is called a detention camp, an internment camp, and a concentration camp in various sources. The Holocaust Encyclopedia of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum simply refers to it as Gurs Camp, reflecting its French name, Camp de Gurs, and perhaps to avoid the controversy that various descriptors might have. Though it was not a death camp, terrible sanitary conditions, lack of potable water, meager food rations, and overcrowding led to many deaths, particularly from typhoid fever and dysentery. It is also worth mentioning that representatives of aid organizations were able to visit the camps in southern France, bring in much-needed supplies, and successfully smuggle out children and place them in orphanages and private homes. A letter dated January 7, 1941, reports on the feeding program, which the American Friends Service Committee sponsored with a $1,000 donation. A group of 3 representatives brought 7 tons of foodstuff and clothing for 500 or 600 persons. One of the members reports being greeted cordially by the director of the camp. The food was to be distributed as supplemental rations based on recommendations of interned doctors and heads of each housing unit. Another report, dated April 2, 1941, paints a rather grim picture of the camp. Of about 10,000 inmates at that time, an extremely high percentage were identified as sick and incapable of camp life. The food rations were described as absolutely insufficient, providing about 30% of indispensable calories, leading to undernourishment. The writer describes the spiritual condition as discouragement which borders on despair. In response to these conditions, in early 1941, a Comité Central d'Assistance was formed by Rabbi S.R. Koppel of Toulouse under the direction of Rabbi Leo Ansbacher, the chaplain of the camp. The committee met twice a week and determined how to distribute the food and clothing that had been donated, among other things. Following the implementation of the final solution in 1942, the captives who remained at Gurs were transported to the Drancy deportation camp outside of Paris. Most were then sent on to Auschwitz. The Gurs Haggadah was handwritten by Aryeh Ludwig Zuckerman. It was a long, time-consuming process, likely done from memory. He apparently wrote it on stencils using a sharpened stone as a stylus. The stencils were taken outside the camp for duplication. This led to an error in which page 6 was printed as the second page on the reverse of page 1. A number of copies of the Haggadah have survived, all identical except for dedications handwritten and signed by Aryeh Zuckerman, Rabbi Ansbacher, and others. The Gurs Haggadah was handwritten using block Hebrew letters with diacritical marks to indicate vowels and the pronunciation of certain consonants. It was printed on 5 double-sided pages, each 21 by 27 centimeters. The only illustration is a drawing of a Seder plate with the ritual objects at the top of page 1. The Haggadah begins with the Hebrew abbreviation Bet He, standing for the words Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, words which are often included in letters and other handwritten material, but not in any printed Haggadah of which I'm aware. Below those letters are the words Haggadah Shel Pesach, Passover Haggadah. The Seder plate is surrounded by the 15 steps of the Seder ritual, a mnemonic device usually chanted at the beginning of the ceremony to remind participants of the order of the rituals. The word Seder means order, and the 15 steps are to be done in the prescribed order. The first step is the Kiddush, the blessing of the wine, to sanctify the holiday. It includes the quotation from Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, about God completing the work of creation and resting on the seventh day, which is used to introduce the Kiddush on Shabbat, on Friday evening. And indeed, the first evening of Passover in 1941 was Friday evening. The other notable feature of this prayer is that the introductory phrase, and to many blessings, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, blessed are you Adonai our God, ruler of the world, is abbreviated, likely to save space. The Kiddush also includes the blessings that one would include only on Saturday night for Havdalah, marking the transition from Shabbat to the weekdays. This likely indicates that a second Seder ritual would have been held that night, as is the custom for Jews outside of the land of Israel, although I was not able to find any source to confirm that this did take place. The first page of the Haggadah then includes the blessing for karpas, the green vegetable, and the Aramaic paragraph halach ma'anu, which declares that matzah is the bread of affliction. The second page, as noted, is out of order, likely because the original was made on a stencil and then copied. The text continues with the 4 questions, the Avadim Hayinu paragraph, which affirms that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the story of the 5 rabbis who celebrated Passover in Bnei Brak and stayed up all night discussing the details of Passover. The only significant part of the Seder ritual that is missing from the Gurs Haggadah is the Birkat Hamazon, the lengthy blessing after the meal, which traditional Jews likely knew by memory. The final 2 pages of the Haggadah include well-known Passover songs. Rather than being handwritten in the Hebrew alphabet, they were typed in transliteration. The 4 songs included are Adir Bimlucha, Adir Hu, Echad Miyodea, and Chad Gad Yah. In 2003, Yad Vashem and the Dvorah Publishing House published the Gurs Haggadah, Passover and Perdition. In addition to a facsimile of the Haggadah, which is in the Yad Vashem collection, there are essays on Passover in the Gurs camp, life in the Gurs camp, researching the Gurs Haggadah, Father's Haggadah, written by Aryeh Zuckerman's son, Rabbi A. Yehoshua Zuckerman, and a concluding essay on victory for the creative spirit behind barbed wire. So how was Passover celebrated in Gurs in April 1941 using this Haggadah? The Passover Seder was conducted in a number of barracks. Matzah, unleavened bread, was brought in for Passover, as were new cooking and eating utensils, which were nevertheless scoured in each of the barracks. As is traditional, Rabbi Ansbacher gave a sermon on the Sabbath before Passover called Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Sabbath, explaining what food was permitted during the holiday and what was forbidden. A list was posted to assure that people knew what they were allowed to eat and what they could not. Among the prohibited items were seminola, oat flakes, tomato paste, beer, and cocoa substitute. Among the permitted items are legumes, which are usually not eaten today by Jews of Ashkenazi, Eastern European descent, but are eaten by Jews of Sephardi, Spanish descent, cheese, chocolate, and pure cocoa. Rice, which is also not eaten by Ashkenazi Jews, was permitted for sick people with the approval of the rabbinate. It is likely that only some of these items would have been among the food provided by the camp, but that individuals might have received packages containing these items. The Central Assistance Committee collected money for the holiday meal to assure that enough food would be provided for everyone. Pinchas Rothschild provides a detailed description of the Passover observance in the camp. He writes, "At the time celebrating the Passover holiday in the Gurs camp, we felt as if a refreshing breeze from the Promised Land had descended upon us via the desert. By the strength of his hand, God took us out from the house of slavery," he wrote. Although he admits that prior to being incarcerated in Gurs, we had not attempted to truly understand or remember the miracle of the Exodus from Egypt, now it was as if that which befell our nation in those distant days touched us and became part of our everyday existence. Rothschild describes the tables being covered with tin from empty cans of preserves, which he describes as the main building material of the camp. They were candlesticks made from Gurs metal and Seder plates, which contained the ritual objects, as well as 3 sheets of matzah. In addition to matzah, the ritual foods included a little salad representing the bitter herbs, haroset, which is often made of apples, nuts, and wine, and an egg. Those who were fortunate enough to have received food packages shared them with others. He describes the ritual. Lights penetrated from inside the barracks, and the sound of songs and the grace after meals were heard outside. Words which had been sung countless times before were sung that night with raised spirits, filled with compassion and promise. One other Passover ritual of note that year has been documented. On the last day of the holiday, the inmates were permitted to gather outside the camp for Yizkor, the service which remembers our loved ones who have passed away. Rabbi Ansbacher led the service and delivered a sermon. Following the service, one of the inmates, Fritz Schleifer, made a watercolor picture depicting the ritual, which was preserved and is now at Yad Vashem. In addition to Passover, other Jewish holidays were also observed in Gurs. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, was observed in the fall of 1941. The camp was provided with machzorim, high holiday prayer books, shofars, the ram's horns, which are sounded on the holiday, and Torah scrolls. Rabbi Ansbacher and Rabbi Koppel shared a message with the community for the new year, which reads in part, "Rosh Hashanah 5702 comes at a difficult moment for us. We are preparing to celebrate the days of awe in a manner vastly different from what we expected. Throughout history, the Jewish people knew how to listen to the call of God and to hear his voice even under the most oppressive circumstances. Only rarely in the Jewish people's long history did the God of our forefathers call out as clearly as he has done during the course of this past year, now drawing to an end. It is incumbent upon us to give him an appropriate answer. Let us seriously and honestly ask ourselves if we have fulfilled our obligation to the Lord and to our fellow human beings, those whose suffering is ours as well. Facing these severe times and the cruel fate which the hand of the Lord has imposed upon you, be true to your conscience and resolve firmly to return to the Creator. During Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, a total of 7 Sukkot were built and decorated in the camp. And they celebrated Hanukkah that winter and the following winter as well, even though deportations had already taken place. In reflecting on the religious observance that occur in Gurs, Claude Lahaire, a French historian, has explained, for those in the camp, the normalcy of life ceased to exist, and a whole new value system took hold. The nuclear family no longer existed. There were no private dwellings to retreat to. There was no profession to work in and no work to complete. There were no salaries to be earned or a standard of living that had to be maintained. What had been essential in the past disappeared, and what was previously viewed as secondary, sewing, artwork, and even religious observance, became the sole purpose of daily existence at Gurs. Apathy would have represented a surrender to the pain, the sorrow, and the loss of human dignity. In her essay at the end of the Yad Vashem book on the Haggadah, entitled Victory for the Creative Spirit Behind Barbed Wire, Yehudit Shendar reflects, behind the barbed wire fences of the Gurs camp at the foothills of the Pyrenees, an extensive and vibrant cultural enterprise was remarkably created out of thin air. She goes on to describe the rich cultural environment that was created in Gurs by musicians, actors, cabaret performers, painters, and graphic artists. She includes this poem by Heine Walfish, a prisoner in the camp, which helps us understand that cultural creations and religious rituals are truly acts of resistance. We produce theater at Gurs. Would you know what that means? Behind the barbed wire, the world blurred, and we, 8,000 men and women, were miserable and uprooted. We were living in total wretchedness, forgotten, abandoned, orphans, packed into gloomy barracks. The storm of war blew over our heads. Would you know what that means? We performed to stay alive. Nobody knows exactly what that means. A slice of bread in exchange for Ibsen, an egg for A Midsummer Night's Dream, and perhaps a handful of seminola peppered with contempt. We rehearsed during freezing nights, almost fainting from hunger. We sang, we danced, we cried, we laughed. We brought joy, light, and life to an audience of thousands. We have no concept of what this means. We revived thousands of desperate people. We inspired courage. We rekindled hope and faith. We endured all of humanity's suffering, but we produced theater. Think of what that means.